Okay, good morning and afternoon, everyone. My name is Michael Merrick. I am the Deputy Head Teacher of Qatar International School in Doha, and I would like to welcome you to using assessment effectively and impactfully in a blended and online learning environment supported through the British schools in the Middle East. Now, the format of today is going to be, first of all, we're going to have 30 minutes, and it's going to be Matt McGinley who is going to be speaking to us from Evidence-Based Education. Then there's going to be 20 minutes where myself and Anika Singh, our Assistant Head Teacher in Primary, are going to give you some practical and useful ways of carrying out assessments in a blended environment. And then at the end, we're going to have 10 minutes for questions. What I would ask in this stage is, could you please make sure that your microphones remain on mute? We are recording the session, so if you don't wish your video to be recorded, please turn it off now. And if you have any questions, I would ask that you don't unmute, please post them in the chat. So I would now like to introduce Matt McGinley from Evidence-Based Education, who is going to start us off. Thank you, Matt. Over to you.
Cheers, Michael. I will just share the slides that I have with you this morning, and I'm hoping that you'll be able to see those now. So thanks for the introduction, Michael. So I'm Matt McGinley, and I'm here from Evidence-Based Education, and we're based in the United Kingdom at the moment, and our role is really, we work with lots of schools around the UK, around the world actually, trying to help them to use the best available research evidence to have a real impact in the classroom, and trying to digest something that could be quite abstract, and what the researchers are producing in universities, and how we can actually apply it in the classroom. As Mike said, if there's any questions, feel free to put them in the chat box, and there's a couple of points that I've got through where we can address some of those, but ask questions at any point as we're going along. So I want to talk about some of the best practice that we've seen in terms of assessment, and particularly given that we're now a year down the line since some schools started in this online or blended environment. So we've spoken with a number of schools, and also we've got a very strong advisory board, and I've spoken ahead of today with John Hattie and Dylan William, who are both advisors, about some of the best practice that they've seen as well, and hopefully can share some of that with you today. I think that the place to actually start is that one of the things that this has done is given an opportunity to take that step back, and we're going to have to rethink our assessment practices given the strange times that we're in. But be able to take that step back and think, well, why are we assessing, and what are we trying to assess? And I think that the thing that we need to think about first of all is, what actually is learning, and what are we trying to assess? And one key take home that we need to think about is, are we assessing for learning, as we would hope, or are we just assessing for performance? And I think that this research on this suggests that performance is more of a short-term thing, whereas learning, we're looking at more about the long-term retention of knowledge and skills. And our assessment practices have to really focus on that. It's all too easy to just assess for performance at the end of a lesson, or by asking questions during the lesson. But how do we know students have truly learned something? I think by way of example, I used to teach. I taught both science and German. Using an example from German, we can teach students about vocab and have vocab tests in class, and I might hope that my students can identify the word Hauptbahnhof, but it's only when we go on a trip to Germany and I tell my students that wir treffen uns um 5:30 in Hauptbahnhof, if they actually turn up at the right time in the train station, then I've started to gain some evidence that they might have learned what we do, because they've been able to take what we covered in that lesson and do it 3 years later, but also transfer it to a new context. So it's no longer just reciting some vocabulary, it's about taking that and applying it in real world. So when we're thinking about what learning is, I think that there's plenty of other definitions out there, but I think that definition that I'm working to is about the long-term retention of knowledge, understanding and skill, and the ability to transfer that to novel contexts. And what we're trying to do with our assessment is really to try and promote that retention and transfer to a different context. All of our assessment practices, I think, have got two key focuses, and we'll come to these, talk about these later on in the session. But assessment is there to try and provide you and provide students with high quality information about what students know, what they can do, and perhaps about what the next steps are. But also assessment or testing is a powerful learning event in and of itself. And as we go on, want to cover some of the overarching principles that we should be thinking about, but then go on to a couple of very specific practices that we can employ, particularly in a long online or blended environment, where we can really use the power of assessment to try and promote learning for our students. Now, when I'm sure in some of your schools, but in lots of schools that we work with, there'll often be a deputy head for teaching and learning, and these two things get sort of put in together. But actually, we have an awful lot of control over teaching, but that doesn't necessarily always equate to learning. And I think particularly in this sort of online environment that we're in at the moment, just because we've taught something doesn't necessarily mean that students have learned it. And it's really quite challenging to sometimes know that. And also, likewise, just because we haven't taught something also doesn't mean that students haven't learned it yet. And particularly where we've got an environment where students are sometimes part-time in school or sometimes at home, and we're requiring students to perhaps use a lot more self-regulation, perhaps working with parents. We've got to be really focused with our assessment that there might well be things that students have learned that we haven't taught them yet, from their own reading, that they've learned from parents, from their own studies. So we really need to acutely try and identify those other things that students have been working on. But like anything, that what we're trying to use with assessment is that bridge between what we've taught and whether students have learned that. But like all bridges, some bridges are better than others, and got the example of two bridges here in this diagram or in these images. And it's exactly the same we could say for assessments, that if we were trying to measure a student's head, actually measure a head, we could get a tape measure. We've got something physical there that we could put a tape measure around, and we could come up with something that's relatively accurate. We might get 74 centimeters. But actually, when we're trying to measure what's inside a student's head, what they've learned, it's actually something that's very intangible. It's actually very challenging to measure. And my colleague, Professor Rob Coe, talks about assessment as a series of multiple inadequate glances. What we're trying to do is to take lots of little peeks into to what students know and can do, in order to try and build up that bigger picture of what they've learned. But one assessment by itself is never going to be able to tell us that. It's just lots and lots of smaller glances. But one of the things that the coronavirus pandemic has really helped us to be able to do in some ways is, when we're in that online or blended environment, there's an awful lot of quite poor proxies for learning in the classroom. So, for example, we lose a lot of those visual cues when students aren't in the classroom. So students looking like they're working hard or with their heads down are often very poor proxies for learning. They're looking busy. Whereas in an online context, then we have to put a lot more focus on the actual responses that our students give, the answers that they give, or the processes that they go through in order to generate those answers. So we can move away from some of those relatively poor proxies for learning and actually start to assess sort of the content that students produce. And what the key take-home message when we spoke to Dylan was, whatever your curriculum, whatever your context, whether it's online or in the classroom, there's some key principles of your assessment practices that remain the same, and that's kind of where I want to start the focus today. There's 4 pillars of great assessment. So when we think about any assessment, whether it's sort of end of topic tests or just a starter where we're trying to get students to retrieve information, we should be thinking about these 4 things. So a focus on purpose, what are we trying to achieve? Validity, so is our assessment valid for that purpose? Is it reliable? And is it valuable, or is it a valuable use of our time? And I'll go through each of these in time. And purpose really is the key, the main, the most important of these 4 principles, because purpose will dictate everything that we go on to do in an assessment process. If your purpose is to try and select students for entry to the school, that's going to look a very different assessment than if the purpose is to tell us what our students know about fronted adverbials. And any of you that are on Twitter will know that this has caused much consternation over the weekend. And should we be teaching grammar to younger students? But if our purpose will dictate what sort of assessment we go on to do. And we want to think about, why are we assessing? What information do we want to generate? What do we want to be able to learn about our students? When should we be doing that? And then that will determine what's the best approach. I think by way of example, when I was teaching German again, I was given a mixed ability class, and the only information I was given at the very beginning was just some grade, a grade for each student. And that relies on me understanding what they were trying to assess, or the teacher that assessed those, what they were trying to assess, what those grades mean. So I needed something different. So right at the very beginning of the year, I wanted to know where students were at, what they already knew. So it meant that I needed an assessment to give me a broad overview of what their current level of German was, because I needed to know this right at the beginning of the year. When was sort of the very first lesson of the year? And in terms of the how, well, I wanted to know what each individual could do. So it became an assessment that was done by the individual in silence, so that we could actually really get a clear insight into what that individual student know, and not what they knew if they collaborated with a friend. So really thinking about what are we trying to do, what are we trying to achieve, will help you just eradicate some of those assessments where we do them just because we've always done them. And particularly in this online or blended setting, it can really help us just take that step back and think, what are we trying to achieve? And is there something better we could be doing with our time? So when we're thinking about purpose, there's three points. What are we assessing, and why are we assessing it? So what are we trying to actually achieve with our assessment? It should always be guided by your curriculum. We have this curriculum document that tells us what we want our students to know and to be able to do. So your assessment should be grounded in that and telling you, can our students do the things within our curriculum? And there's this phrase, actionable meanings, and we want our assessment process to try and generate some actionable meanings for us. So that tells us what our students can do, what they know, or perhaps what are the next steps for our students. The second pillar of any good assessment is thinking about validity. And I often hear the phrase, oh, it wasn't a valid test. But I don't think there is such a thing as a valid test. There is no one assessment that is universally valid. Validity is thinking about, is a test valid for a particular purpose? And I have this question up here. So Jack has 7 sweets. Jack perambulates towards the nearest confectionery store before proceeding to purchase another 5 sweets. After debating whether to eat them himself, he decides to generously divide his candies with his friend Gemma. How many sweets is Jack left with? What we have there is a question that's trying to assess a student's division ability. Perhaps mental arithmetic. 5 plus 7, did we say? Yeah, so 12 sweets divided by 2, the answer is 6. But how many students would get that question correct? Some would, but actually we probably end up assessing their vocabulary ability rather than actually division, which is what we're intending to assess. This question might be valid for assessing vocabulary, but it's probably not a valid question for assessing students' division ability. And I have a shocking confession to make, but there was one occasion where I only saw my class a couple of times a week, so I sent home grades to parents for German based upon one written homework that we'd done. And thinking about there's this whole domain of mathematics, but if we tried to give students a grade for maths based upon one algebra test, that test is probably not valid for that particular purpose. So I'm really thinking if we want to assign grades to students, we need to think of a test that is valid and appropriate for that. So validity is about is it valid for a particular purpose? The third of the great pillars to think about is reliability. And this is especially important when we're looking at an online or blended environment, because we're faced with some of the challenges that when we've got students in the classroom in front of us, we can see what they're producing. We've got that opportunity to walk around the classroom and to actually see what's going down on paper and to be able to quickly spot misconceptions or address them. Whereas actually that's really quite challenging when we're in this online environment. So potentially being online does reduce the reliability of our assessments. And when we think about reliability, we'll talk about two things. So it's whether it's replicable. If a student took the same test 10 times, would they get a fairly similar score each time? And is it accurate? Does it accurately represent their ability? Or their ability or their knowledge in a particular area. And when we think about reliability, even the most reliable assessments, some of the most reliable assessments are things like GCSE and A-level examinations, public examinations. Even then, the GCSE grades are only right about 2/3 of the time. About 1/3 of all GCSE grades that are awarded ultimately by the exam board don't reflect the work that students produce, come down to some sort of reliability errors within the assessment. And that goes up to as high as about 50% in subjects like English and history. Exams are nowhere near as reliable as we like to think that they are. But these have a whole team working on them all year to develop the questions, trained markers, and they're just not as reliable as we like to think they are. And unfortunately, classroom assessment is often relatively unreliable, and when we give students a mark such as a 56% or something on a test, there's often quite a large margin of error attached to that. But one of the critical things when we think about reliability is it's almost proportional to the importance of the assessment. If we've got an assessment where we're going to be allocating a final grade that's ultimately going to affect a student's life chances, then we want it to be incredibly reliable. But actually, particularly when we've now that some of the main exams have been cancelled this year, then it means that there's perhaps less of a focus on reliability, where we can use low stakes testing and assessment to really try and understand about what our students can do. And there's perhaps less importance on the reliability of those assessments when things are kept relatively low stakes. And the final of those pillars is when we think about value, and that's about the cost of doing an assessment. Actually, the costs of doing assessments are incredibly high in terms of the time it takes to set the questions, to students to complete any questioning or any activities we give them, to mark them, to offer feedback. But if the quality of the information that you're getting isn't commensurate with the amount of time that you're putting in, then we probably should be doing something different with that time. So there's always an opportunity cost. And again, one of the things that Professor Rob Coe says is if an assessment doesn't have the capacity to surprise you or your students, what's the point in doing it? We want it to be able to tell us, or even have the capacity to tell us something new about our students, something we didn't already know. So it takes an awful lot of time when it comes to assessment, either cost if we're buying them in externally, or just in terms of our time. So really thinking about, is every assessment that we're doing, is that a valuable use of time, or is there something else that we could be doing with that might be having more of an impact? So when you're thinking about any of your assessment practices, then I think there's some simple checks to think about, which is, what is the purpose? Why are we assessing? Is the assessment that we have, does it have the capacity to actually fulfill this purpose, and is it appropriate? Does it measure the things that we want it to measure? And just want to very briefly touch upon, we said about generating actionable meanings. When we talk about assessment, it's intrinsically linked with feedback, and I could do a whole hour now about feedback in an online context, perhaps one for a different day. But does everyone that's seeing the information that you generate, whether that's just you, or whether that's senior leaders or colleagues in school, or your students, do they know how to interpret and how to use it correctly? And Daisy Christodoulou says that feedback is not a statement but a recipe, and particularly when we're in that blended environment, thinking that, making sure that our feedback based upon our assessments has three key things about it. So it tells students where they're going, so perhaps with exemplars for what a good answer, what a successful piece of work looks like. So where am I going? How am I doing in getting there? So what stage am I at now on that process towards getting that sort of level of mastery? And what are those next steps? What are the next things? And making sure that feedback does those three things is the best way to try and make sure that it's impactful. And I think it's worth pointing out, particularly with many exams being cancelled, a grade tends not to do any of those three things. And we've got a real opportunity to try and move away from single grades and to actually providing effective feedback that really tells our students what are those next steps. Before we move on to just a couple of more practical points, have there been any questions in the chat box, Michael?
No, not at present, Matt.
No.
If anyone does have any questions, could you please post them into the chat? Thank you.
Perfect. There's another point coming shortly, so if there's any questions, put them in the chat and we'll address them in a couple of minutes. So I said before about testing being having the potential to be a powerful learning event in itself, and this quote comes from Robert Bjork over at UCLA, and says that the testing just by itself actually helps to cement cognitive links, so links within our brains, and actually be able to help us to be able to recall information in the future. And every time you ask a question or you set a task, it makes students think and retrieve information. And actually this process helps to change long-term memories. So trying to make sure that we encourage students to output more is particularly powerful in an online environment. The key thing, though, to remember when we're thinking about this book called retrieval practice, so practicing retrieving information, is that that has a powerful impact on the cognitive processes in our brain. But if students have got misconceptions or things that they've misunderstood, it will go on to reinforce those. So when we think about retrieval practice, it should be a really important process to be able to try and identify student misconceptions, and then we can actually be able to address those. So when we talk about retrieval practice, we talk about the testing effect, and there's numerous studies that show repeated testing tends to lead to better outcomes than repeated study. So particularly when we're in a blended environment, an online environment, there's a really crucial role for low stakes practice quizzing and questioning is really, really key to be able to identify what students are able to know and perhaps where those misconceptions are. And I think if you haven't found them before, 2 really useful resources to be able to get some really high quality questions. Adam Boxer has retrieval roulette, and he's got on his blog loads of different sets of retrieval practice questions that you can use for different phases, different subjects, but just keeping that low stakes practice quizzing, which encourages students to take the knowledge, the information they've got, and actually output it rather than just trying to input more information. And there's also another website, particularly good for science and maths questions, but Diagnostic Questions is another free tool that really helps you to generate really high quality questions that we can use with our students and be able to identify where they're at and what those next steps are. The final thing as well that the research suggests is really quite powerful is what we call hinge questions. And by hinge questions, what we really mean is the questions at those key points in a sequence of learning or a lesson that really tell us what do our students know and are we ready to move on to whatever we're planning on doing next. And especially in an online environment or blended environment, trying to identify those critical points in your lessons or a sequence of learning and working with colleagues obviously is important too, where we want to really find out, have our students understood this? Can they do the things that we hope they're able to? Because if they can't do these things, then we're probably not going to understand the next thing. A prime example might be in geography. We might start a lesson talking about plate tectonics, and there's a real hinge point there where we need to know whether students have understood plate tectonics before we can go on to talking about volcanoes or earthquakes. And at that point, we would probably use some form of hinge question to really identify, have students understood the concept of plate tectonics? Because if they haven't, there's no point in moving on to where we're going next. So good hinge questions will tell you what your students know, but also, are we at a point where everybody is able to move on to that next step? And these, I think, often can be really quite good, if particularly multiple choice questions can be really useful as hinge questions, because they can give you a very quick overview, often using tools like Google Forms or even Padlet can help you very quickly be able to determine, have our students understood what we want them to know, so we can move on. And a well-formulated multiple choice question will often give you some really powerful information very, very quickly. The research shows that the best multiple choice questions actually only have three responses there, so an A, B, or a C answer. Often we put 4 possible answers. The best ones have 3. And a good multiple choice question, every single, if you know the answer, only one of the answers is clearly correct to you. If you don't understand the topic, then all 3 answers should be plausible. And if we really think about our multiple choice questions, we can develop really good questions that will, if students get it right, then we obviously understand, they understand it, we're ready to move on. But actually, if you create the wrong answers so that they can tell you where the misconception is, and you can very quickly see that if most students are getting it wrong but giving a particular answer, this is the thing that they have misunderstood or that they're not quite prepared for. And again, that can then start to help you to respond and determine what your next steps are for your students. And again, especially when students aren't necessarily always with you in the classroom, having these key hinge points where you can make sure that we've come together and we're at a point where we can move on to wherever we're going next are really critical. So going back to what we said right at the beginning, when we're thinking about good questioning, good assessment, we wanted to do two things really. We wanted to get students to engage in thinking, because when students think hard, learning is more likely to occur. But also we're trying to generate reliable information that's going to inform our decisions and what we do next, our next steps for students. Before I pass back over to Michael, if you want to find out more about these, or there's some free resources about assessment and within that blended environment, we have our EBE resource library. There's a bit.ly link up here at the top, which is a shortened link to be able to access. It's a completely free resource, and within there we've got lots of ebooks. So this is just one example about how to design really good multiple choice questions. But we've got other ebooks you see about our 4 pillars of great assessment, what every teacher needs to know about assessment. It's completely free to access. So I'd suggest potentially after this, you can use that bit.ly link, and there's plenty of resources in there that will help you to just perhaps to think more deeply about some of these topics if you find them interesting. Are there any questions since I last asked you to put questions in the box?
Yes, Rachel Hardwick has asked, how do you suggest measuring whether students have understood their learning when we are aware parents are often guiding and giving excess input?
Yeah, that's identified a real challenge, and this actually comes back to what we were talking about with reliability. Certainly don't want to cast aspersions at students and at parents, but it is a real challenge that you identify that our assessments, we don't necessarily know how much or how much input we're receiving from others. Unfortunately, there isn't necessarily a quick, a simple answer to that. I think that the real key actually comes in is thinking about your messaging to students and to parents as well, and trying to particularly keeping things low stakes, I think has a big impact on that. Because where things are high stakes, or students think that there's going to be a mark awarded or a grade, then that creates that perverse incentive that parents perhaps want to have more input so their student does as well as possible. So being completely clear that the purpose of your assessment is to tell you what students know, what they can do, that you're not recording a grade for this, you're not going to be sharing it with other staff, with senior leaders, that the key is that purpose of the assessment and trying to keep it low stakes, and the purpose being to tell you what students know and can do, and not about grading or allocating a final mark. And being clear about that to students and to parents just can help to avoid some of those perverse incentives. I hope that helps.
Rachel, I think also part of the presentation that myself and Anika are going to do will also support you with a few different strategies which will help with the question you've asked.
Are there any more questions, or are you ready to pass over to you, Michael?
There doesn't appear to be any more questions at the moment.
Okay, I'll wait around until the end, and if there's other more, we can address them.
Thank you, Matt. Okay, so Matt, if you start presenting, put yourself on to mute. I'll now take over from our side. Okay. Well, first of all, I'd like to say a big thank you to Matt. That was very informative, very useful, and a perfect platform for myself and Anika to take over. So, as I mentioned before, my name is Michael Merrick. I'm the Deputy Head of Secondary at Qatar International School, and I'm going to be joined here by Anika Singh, who is our Assistant Head of Primary. Again, looking at using assessment effectively and impactfully in a blended and online learning environment. Now, Matt's given us a great foundation as to what assessment looks like, how we formulate assessment, and what we have tried to do is to try and merge the assessment with assessment and some feedback strategies, which combined will help to create the full picture of a series of strategies that will really help us in this new environment we're in. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to give you a little idea of the context about where we're based. So we're Qatar International School. It's a private British curriculum, international school based in Doha. We've been around for about 40 years. Last academic year, 2019 and 20, our school was actually awarded the Penta Gold Standard Award after we achieved outstanding in every single area of our British Schools Overseas Inspection. We also have the accreditation through BSMA, CIS, which is the Council of International Schools, and the QNSA, which is the Qatar National Schools Accreditation. So our school size is approximately 2,000 students from FS1 to year 13. We have over 70 nationalities, and up to 99% of our students are actually BML students. They're bilingual and multilingual. Most students in our school, English is their second language. Almost all of our class teachers have UK-based qualifications, and the examination boards we tend to work with are Cambridge, Pearson and AQA. And we're also a designated Levy centre, so we facilitate Levy training, and we also work in partnership to facilitate face-to-face support for the national professional qualifications like the NPQH and the NPQSL. So the first things that I thought was actually that were really relevant here, especially in the environment we're in, is this picture. So for a fair selection, everybody has to take the same exam. Please climb this tree. Now, I don't think this has ever been more pertinent, because we're now at a situation where, because of the blended learning, it is very easy to simply put on a single task, avoid differentiation because it's already complicated enough. And I have walked into several classrooms already throughout this process. Now, I don't know if you noticed the fish, a sorry little fish. I have seen that face on loads of students just now. And differentiation is something which we really pride ourselves on here, and inclusion, and we try to be quite versatile in our approach. So these are some of the things I want to focus on. Equally, there's the question of why can't we be tested on what we learn rather than learn what we're going to be tested on? Now, in Key Stage 4 and Key Stage 5, it's quite difficult because the curriculum is very prescribed and there are official exams. But again, you've got to remember that what we're trying to do here is we're really trying to develop life skills, and we're trying to really encourage lifelong learning. So the strategies that I'm going to talk about are really in line with that. So there were 5 different strategies which we found to be really effective during this time. Now, in our current situation, COVID, we have 50% of our students attending physically in school, and 50% of our students attend the same lessons virtually from home. So it's a rotation. Now, since this kicked in, obviously the key elements which we've all had to adapt within school, we have embraced the Google Suite virtual learning environment, which is key to some of the resources which I'm going to talk about today. We also had to completely adapt our timetables, completely adapt the curriculum mapping, a whole load of new resources, the entire way we communicate, and our brand new focus on individual student intervention in this new and adapting world. So I'm now going to start off by talking about Mote. Now, Mote is basically an extension available in Google, which allows you to record verbal feedback. Now, Mote's available in a variety of different languages, 20 world languages, but where Mote has been incredibly valuable is when we are assessing students, we're able to record feedback verbally, which is fast, it's quick, it's effective. We can then get the students to respond. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you an example from Mariam Abba, one of our French teachers in school, of how she's been utilising this in her class. So I'm going to play this video for you now, if you just give me 1 moment.
Hello, this is an example of feedback using Mote, so using oral feedback. So you can see here, this is a Google Classroom assignment on Google Slide. The student has completed the work, and you can add a private comment here. So using this little icon here, if you click on it, you can then record your comment. So I've given her a general comment that she listened to, and then also what I like to do is to give them a more specific comment on the work itself. So I highlight a word, for example, here if we go on Ma Famille, and then you just click on comment, and you have got the same icon here, and you can just record your feedback. So I have added some comments on different words. She's listened to it, and then she has made the correction, so meaning that showing that she has responded to my feedback. There's many other features to using Mote. I will try and record the video just showing that. Thank you.
Okay, I'll just start presenting again. So, as you can see there, it's a very, very simple tool which can be used to give instantaneous feedback, and it's really, really easy in terms of how we are assessing and impactfully assessing our students, and to make sure that they are actually acting on what we are giving them. The next strategy that I'm going to move on to is to talk about digital differentiation. Now, digital differentiation in a time where you don't have all of your pupils in front of you, in many cases like this, it's very difficult to really assess exactly how certain pupils are coping. And this is a very simple tool. You can set this up in terms of a Google slide. You can do it in forms. Basically, you could set up individual sheets with individual student names on them, where they are allocated and they can go and work on that particular sheet, where they have a differentiated activity. It may be, though, that every sheet is potentially numbered, so you direct specific students to go to a specific group. You also may have groups already preset. These are very simple strategies, but they've been some of the most effective strategies in terms of assessing pupil understanding, which I have seen being used across our school. Now, I'll give you some examples of this. So basically, in some cases, you may have the teacher who will set two differentiated tasks, and they may be separated onto separate pages where the students work on their own specific task, or indeed the students may decide which ones they want to work on. But what I've seen that's probably been more effective is actually the case here, where you have in the corner here, this is an example from our primary school. So there are actually 4 different questions which were on 4 different slides, and the teacher was able to direct specific students to specific slides, and she was able to go on and watch as they were completing the work and be able to see and give them real-time feedback. Now, further to that, what you can also do is you can also create individual documents per child with the specific work you want them to do, like the example to the right here regarding some English and literacy work, where you can actually go in and type real-time feedback as they are actually working on the task. Now, I believe it was what Rachel mentioned earlier, how can you know that it is their own work? Well, depending on the environment, as it's taking place in real time, you can watch the students potentially be typing their answer. They may be typing in formulas, they may be mathematically based, it may be related to history, geography, any of these subjects. This strategy actually lends itself well to all areas of education, both from foundation stage right through to further education itself. So these are two key strategies which so far we have found to be very, very effective. I'm now going to pass over to Anika, who's going to talk to us about the third strategy. Anika.
Thank you. So the third tool that we wanted to talk about was Jamboard, which is our digital whiteboard cloud collaboration. So if you think of your historical PowerPoint that you would have at the front of your classroom, Jamboard brings it right to your students, and it allows you to engage with them, especially in this remote learning environment, with your presentation that they can then have access to. So you're sharing your jams just like you would with your slides, and all children will have access and be able to get onto it. If you'd like to click the slide for me, Michael. So I just want to show you a couple of examples of where it has worked really well. So I've picked one from secondary and one from primary, where this secondary teacher has asked each child to upload a photo of their work on their designated slide. The teacher's then been able to use Post-its, which are embedded into Jamboard, to comment on the work, mark it, and provide feedback. What's great is that can be live in the lesson. If you feel like it's necessary, you can go away, have a look at it, and come back. But as soon as it's up there, the children have access to it. So where you might not be able to handle their books or have their books in as often, you can then have that feedback with them. They can come back, and you can see on the slide there, the children are writing their immediate feedback straight away. Where we've seen this really effective in primary, thank you, is live within the lesson. So the teacher would share the Jamboard in the lesson, and talking of kind of like that hinge questions that Matt was talking about, having the reliability of data to make sure that the children have a good understanding, and using that assessment for learning techniques that you would normally do with maybe a whiteboard in your classroom, exit tickets, things like that. You can have the children adding sticky notes to the page with their ideas. You set the question, you set the challenge, and they can then input straight away, adding as many sticky notes as necessary, and you'll know then in the background whose was whose. And at the same time, you're engaging your children in school, whether it's digitally adding to this or using their whiteboards, and you can type them in. So Jamboard's a really nice way to get the children interacting with your presentation rather than doing it to them. The next tool I wanted to talk about was Pear Deck. So Pear Deck's just a recent addition with Google, and it's a way to turn your presentation slides into interactive activities. The reason why I really like Pear Deck is because it gives you some anonymity from the students. So where you want to assess them and you want to see their individual responses so they can't see each other's work, Pear Deck really allows you to do that. And I'm just going to ask Michael to show you a quick video of how it works as a formative assessment tool. So you can see there, as Michael's bringing back the presentation, you can see there then that the anonymity of it, allowing children to then put in their answers, allows you to do, we've seen some great things where teachers have held debates with students. They've then had to put in their responses, as you'll see on the slide that Michael's about to click onto. They then put their thumbs up, thumbs down, and then you get that information with this list of names of which children have given you which answer. It can be used across all subjects. Another way that we've seen it used really nicely in terms of assessment for learning, assessment of learning, is the exit tickets at the top. If you see in the top corner there, the drag your dot to how you are feeling, it gives you that instant feedback as a teacher of how the children are doing, and it allows you to then set up your groups for the next day, at which point you may be using another tool. What's great about all these tools we're showing you is they're all embedded into Google. So if you are using Google, and I think most of them can be used with Microsoft, you can then use them every day and embed them into your slides. I'll hand back over to Mike.
Thank you, Anita. So the very last thing I'm going to talk to you about today is the fifth strategy, which we have found to be very effective, and it's called Go Formative. Now, in Go Formative, you've got the opportunity to create multiple choice questions, which Matt alluded to earlier. True or false, short answers, show your work. There's a variety of different strategies we can use here. Now, I'm going to show you a short video in just a moment, but one of the most effective ways I've actually seen this being used is when I walked into a class and I was doing an observation, the teacher had asked the pupils to type in a specific formula, and on real time on the board, he was able to see all the pupils who fully understood the structure of the formula, where the misconceptions were. It was getting presented to everybody. He also had the opportunity to only present some students if he wished. He had the opportunity to not present it at all and to just use this for his own information. Now, what was very apparent there was the students absolutely loved it, and equally, it ensured that you had complete engagement both at home and in class. The students were fully engaged throughout the learning, and the tools we're talking about are tools which really allow you to break that down, because that's one of the hardest challenges during this blended learning, where you're trying to engage those students at home and making sure that they are indeed engaged and they are progressing and they are developing. So I'm going to show you a short video now from Go Formative.
Welcome to Formative. Here's a quick introduction to Formative. Formative is a site that allows you to quickly and easily create formative assessments and assignments for your classes. For any formative, you can add many different question types, as well as add different types of content. You can even upload your own resources and add questions on top, as well as searching for existing questions in our library of thousands of formatives uploaded by other educators. For most questions that you add to a formative, you can set an answer key, which allows for auto grading, saving you time. You also have options like allowing for partial credit and randomizing the order to discourage cheating. You can also tag questions to standards, which allows you to track student progress over time. Once your students start to respond, their responses will appear in your View Responses screen. This updates in real time, so as soon as your students start to answer, you will see answers appearing here. They'll also be color-coded if the questions have been set up for auto-grading. You can click on any question to read, and you can grade right from the screen. You can type feedback for a student, and even use emojis, audio, images, video, or even LaTeX math. Students can send messages to you as well. If you click into a question, then you can view multiple responses at once, and you can even grade more than one response at the same time, again saving you time, and type feedback from multiple students.
Now, there are several other things that the Go Formative can also do. So there's some of the ones that have been extremely that I have found extremely useful in our schools so far. So I hope that what we've been able to do here is to give you some strategies which you can use to assist you with the assessment during this time, and to assist you impactfully and effectively. So what I'm now going to do is I'm going to pass over to Anika, who's going to talk about some of the impacts these 5 strategies can have in your school.
Thanks, Michael. So really, we wanted to bring back the end of the presentation to what the impact is of all of these different tools, talking a little bit about what Matt's alluded to, talking a little bit about how we can then bring these things together. Some of the things that we've seen is obviously having that instant feedback with students. A year ago, when we first entered into this situation and we were kind of lost with what to do, it wasn't in our normal practice. The most difficult thing was communicating with our students, and we really weren't able to do that very well. All of these tools that we've now started to embed into our daily practice have allowed for that instant feedback. Another thing that's great about all of these tools is that they allow all students to be engaged. They are engaged with their assessment. They're engaged knowing that, like Matt was saying, it's low stakes, getting them to make sure that they understand that they are still being assessed, we're still looking at the work that they're doing, and it's impactful and purposeful. What's really nice is assessment for learning, which you would normally do in your classroom, even walking around, sitting with groups, exit tickets when they're walking out the door, starters and plenaries. You can do that even with students who are not physically present by embedding some of these tools and skills. A great thing is obviously the real-time element. A lot of teachers are now looking for how to access their students at home in real time, give them the next steps and feedback that they need to impact their their learning the next day. Teachers can create inclusive resources, work and activities. So it's allowing you to make sure that you're catering to all the needs in your class without having to be sending out multiple pieces of work, multiple assignments. All of this can be done on the same platform. For example, if you were using Jamboard or GoFormative, any of those. And thinking overall then, if we're thinking about the year that we're in and not having exams and not having the same level of data that we have, what's nice is having all of these tools gives you that bank of evidence, that bank of data that can feed into your overall performance of students over the year. So you've always got that evidence bank digitally now. And then a great thing is obviously they're really easy to use and all of them are free. So you can go in and add them to your daily practice or share them out and people can start using them. And then Michael's just going to talk to you a little bit about how the QIS data has been impacted. If I'll hand over to Michael. Thank you.
Thanks, Anika. So some of the key things that I've seen in terms of how this data has been used is like a massive impact on future planning. And as Anika said there, it's in real time. So with the difficulty of being able to assess effectively, these strategies are hugely beneficial. And it actually means, if done in a planned way, you can actually get more assessment data more often, more timely, and more accurately. Further to that, the progress can also, with it being measured in real time, it allows you to be far more strategic, and it can allow you to really tailor some of those differentiated activities, which in turn will definitely be improving attainment. So we're going to be doing a full analysis on the data that we've had from the first term through to the second term. Our reporting is actually underway, and I will be posting some further feedback on that about my findings of the true effectiveness of these 5 strategies. So what I would like to do at this particular point is I'd like to say a big thank you to Anika for her support with the presentation, and to Matt. And I would now like to ask, if you have any questions, could you please post them into the chat? And thank you very much for listening.